Forget the Hollywood myths. The death of the West's most feared outlaw wasn't a shootout, it was a biological liquidation. In a room smelling of stale sweat and boiling cabbage, a friend waited for the perfect moment to blow the back of Jesse's head off for a paycheck. Witness the nauseating reality of the betrayal that turned a legend into a corpse before he even hit the floor. This is the story of a rat, a revolver, and the sheer banality of evil. Blood on flowered wallpaper dries with alarming speed, transforming from a crimson testament of vitality into a dirty, brownish crust that resembles nothing so much as common rust. This is the true color of history when one scrapes away the gold leaf of legends and the romantic chaff of dime novels. In that suffocatingly humid April of 1882, the city of St. Joseph, Missouri, held no space for dueling nobility or the epic confrontations of equal adversaries. There was only naked biology and primitive economics at play, a tired organism, cornered by its own notoriety, and a smaller, greedier organism decided to convert another man's death into hard currency. Jesse James, a name that made shopkeepers tremble with a cocktail of fear and desire, was not dying in the saddle, but on the floor of his own parlor, while his brain, which once orchestrated audacious raids, slowly dripped down the plaster wall. The atmosphere in the house on the hill was thick enough to choke a man, heavy with the scent of stale tobacco, boiled cabbage, and the sharp, metallic tang of anxiety. Outside, the world was modernizing with ruthless efficiency. Telegraph wires sliced the sky like scars, and locomotives screamed their mechanical dominance over the plains. But inside, time had congealed into a loop of paranoia and waiting. Jesse Woodson James, at the age of 34, was no longer the dashing Confederate guerrilla who had ridden with Bloody Bill Anderson. He was a walking collection of psychosomatic disorders and old injuries, a crumbling monument to a lost cause hiding behind the mundane pseudonym of Thomas Howard. His body was a map of violence, a geography of scar tissue and bullet holes that ached with the shifting barometric pressure. He was a living anachronism, an inflamed shard of the Civil War that a society striving for industrialization and order could no longer digest. The frontier was closing, not with a bang, but with the scratching of pens in ledgers and the ticking of clocks. He was being replaced not by sheriffs with shining stars, but by railway timetables and the corporate detectives of the Pinkerton Agency, a faceless, cold machine that ground bright individualists into gray bone meal. Every breath he took was a theft from the hangman, and the stress of this biological survival had worn his nerves down to raw, exposed wires. In this sweltering domestic cage, permeated with the smell of unwashed bodies and animal fear, sat Robert Ford. He was the perfect product of his era, a nonentity hungering for greatness not through creation or deed, but through appropriation. Bob Ford worshipped Jesse, but it was the affection of a parasite for a host it intends to hollow out from the inside. He slept in the outlaw's house, ate his bread, and meticulously calculated the market value of his idol's head. $10,000 was the figure promised by Governor Crittenden, a sum capable of turning any loyalty into dust. It was an economic equation, simple and brutal, where the variable of friendship was removed to solve for profit. Ford and his brother Charlie were rats in human shape, scuttling through the floorboards of history. Yet, the cynical observer must admit that it is the rats who survive when the lions perish from starvation or high-caliber rounds. There was no hatred in Robert Ford's watery eyes as he watched Jesse move about the room, only the icy calculation of a small-time grocer coming to collect an overdue debt from a bankrupt patron. He watched the way Jesse favored his left leg, the way his eyes darted to the window at the sound of a passing wagon. Ford was studying the structural weaknesses of a demolition project. The scene was nauseatingly domestic, stripped of all cinematic pathos or grandeur. The heat was oppressive, a wet blanket that made shirts cling to backs and turned the air into soup. Jesse, tormented by the temperature, made a fatal error in judgment. He unbuckled his gun belt, heavy with the weight of 2 large revolvers, and carelessly tossed it onto the bed. It was a gesture of surrender to the weather, a moment of fatal relaxation in his own den. He complained that the weapons were chafing him, though the true reason was likely a delusional sense of safety, the fatal slackness of a predator before a nap. For a moment, the room was silent save for the buzzing of a confused fly battering itself against the windowpane. Jesse noticed that a dusty picture on the wall, a needlepoint or perhaps a lithograph of a racehorse, was hanging crookedly. The disorder offended his sudden, petty need for domestic control. He dragged a cane-bottomed chair to the wall and stepped up onto it. He turned his back to the room, his back to the world, and his back to the Ford brothers. In that instant, the great bandit was reduced to a housewife tidying up before guests arrived. It was a malicious, humiliating irony of fate. The men who had survived the withering fire of Union cavalry became the perfect stationary target in a moment of bourgeois comfort. Robert Ford did not hesitate for a second. There was no internal struggle, no Shakespearean soliloquy about betrayal. He drew his pearl-handled revolver, a gift from Jesse himself, and cocked the hammer. The mechanical click was deafening in the small room, a sound of finality that surely registered in Jesse's mind a fraction of a second before the end. But the outlaw did not turn. He was busy dusting a frame, completely absorbed in the triviality of the act. The barrel aligned with the back of his head, behind the right ear, targeting the brain stem where the instincts for survival had burned so brightly for so long. The deafening crack of the gunshot tore through the humidity, shattering the illusion of peace. The bullet entered the skull and instantly extinguished the consciousness of the legend, spraying the contents of his mind across the plaster and the floral wallpaper. There were no last words, no curses hurled at his betrayer. The body simply collapsed like a sack of rotten grain, gravity claiming what was rightfully hers. The sound of the skull hitting the floor was heavy and dull, a meat-slapping thud that signaled the end of an era. Zeralda, Jesse's wife, rushed into the room, her screams piercing the ringing silence. It was not a theatrical lament suitable for the stage, but the animal howl of a female who has lost her mate, a raw and ugly sound of biological distress. She threw herself over the body, her dress soaking up the pooling blood, while the Ford brothers stood awkwardly, the smoke from the revolver drifting lazily toward the ceiling. They did not look like conquerors. They stepped over the still warm corpse not with the stride of victors, but with the hurried shuffle of thieves who have stolen something too heavy for their pockets. They exited the house into the blinding sunlight of St. Joseph, leaving behind the weeping woman and the fatherless children. Their destination was the telegraph office. They needed to send a wire to the governor, to validate the transaction, to exchange the fresh blood on their hands for amnesty and a check. They walked through the mud of the street, two small men casting long shadows only because the sun was low. They believed they had purchased immortality. They did not yet realize that society, which had demanded the death of the monster, would instantly recoil from the monsters who killed him. The blood on the wallpaper was already beginning to dry, turning that specific, rusty shade of brown. The house fell silent again, save for the weeping. The organism known as Jesse James had ceased to function, his metabolism halted by lead and treachery. The legend was dead, but the machinery of the Wild West, the grind of commerce, the indifference of the state, and the hunger of the desperate, continued to churn without pausing for a single beat. This was not a tragedy, it was merely a liquidation of assets. Jesse Woodson James, at the age of 34, was no longer a man but a walking collection of psychosomatic disorders and ancient injuries hiding beneath the unremarkable pseudonym of Thomas Howard. This was not the gallant Confederate cavalier who had once ridden with the bushwhackers, hair flying in the wind like a banner of rebellion. This was an exhausted paranoid, a creature whose body was a topographical map of scar tissue and bullet holes, serving as a throbbing barometer for every shift in the weather. He was a living anachronism, an inflamed and festering shard of the Civil War that a society striving for industrialization and sterile order could no longer digest. The digestive tract of history was rejecting him. He was being replaced, and the replacement was not a romantic figure of equal stature. He was not being hunted by sheriffs with gleaming stars and codes of honor, but by the relentless march of telegraph poles, the cold logic of railway timetables, and the corporate detectives of the Pinkerton Agency. This was a faceless, frigid machine, a mechanism designed to grind bright, chaotic individualists into a uniform, gray bone meal suitable for paving the roads of commerce. The era of the gunfighter was dying, suffocated by the era of the accountant and the actuary. The physical reality of Jesse James was a stark contrast to the dime novel illustrations that depicted him as an eternal youth with a jaw of granite. In truth, his chest was a cage of pain, the legacy of a Union bullet that had pierced his right lung years ago during the surrender at Lexington. Every breath was a negotiation with his own damaged tissue, a rasping reminder of a war that had ended for the world but continued to rage within his own pleura. The damp air of the Missouri spring settled into that old wound like a fungal infection, making him cough with a sound that was less like a human clearing his throat and more like dry leaves rattling in a coffin. Living as Thomas Howard required a performance that drained his remaining vitality more than any bank robbery ever could. He had to shrink himself, to hunch his shoulders and dull his eyes, to discuss the price of coal and the quality of horse feed with neighbors who would have fainted had they known the predator standing at their fence line. This duality was a psychological cancer. He was a wolf forced to wear the skin of a sheep, but the skin was tight, itching constantly, and the smell of his own deception was nauseating. He was trapping himself in a domestic prison of his own making, where the bars were made of lies and the warden was his own fear of recognition. The pressure of the hunt had evolved from a chase into a siege. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency did not sleep, because corporations do not need sleep. They were the private army of the railroads, the enforcers of capital, and they operated with a budget that eclipsed the treasuries of small nations. Alan Pinkerton did not view Jesse as a rival, he viewed him as a discrepancy in the ledger, a red number that needed to be erased to balance the books. The relentless nature of this pursuit had stripped away Jesse's ability to trust, eroding his mind until suspicion became his only remaining instinct. This paranoia was not unfounded, it was the rational response of an organism living in a hostile ecosystem. The attack on his family's farm years earlier served as a brutal testament to the new rules of engagement. The detectives had tossed an incendiary device, a flare, they claimed, though it acted like a grenade, into the James family cabin. It had not killed Jesse. Instead, it had blown the arm off his mother, Zerelda, and killed his young half-brother, Archie. The image of his mother's blood mingling with the soot of the hearth was burned into his retinas, a constant, looping film of trauma that played whenever he closed his eyes. That explosion had marked the death of any lingering chivalry in the conflict. It was a declaration that the new powers, the railroads and the banks, viewed flesh and blood as collateral damage. Jesse realized then that he was not fighting men, but a system. You cannot duel a system. You cannot shoot a corporation in the heart because it has no heart, only a vault. This realization fueled a bitterness that was toxic, a bile that ate away at his stomach lining and turned his temper into a hair-trigger mechanism. He was fighting a war against the future, and the future was armed with unlimited ammunition. The geography of the West was closing in on him, shrinking with every mile of track laid by the Union Pacific and the Santa Fe. The open range, once a sanctuary for outlaws and drifters, was being dissected by barbed wire, the devil's rope. These rusted iron thorns turned the endless horizon into a grid of property rights and trespass warnings. For a man like Jesse, who defined his existence by mobility and the freedom to vanish, the fences were a form of asphyxiation. The world was becoming owned, labeled, and fenced, leaving no dark corners for a shadow to hide. His gang, the James Younger gang, had been decimated, not just by bullets but by the attrition of time and the prison system. The disaster at Northfield, Minnesota, had been the turning point, a meat grinder that had chewed up the younger brothers and left them rotting in cells. Now, Jesse was forced to scrape the bottom of the barrel, recruiting men who were not hardened guerrillas but petty thieves and opportunists. He was a general without an army, forced to rely on the loyalty of men who had never ridden through the fire of the Civil War, men who saw him not as a commander but as a meal ticket. This degradation of his inner circle was palpable in the presence of the Ford brothers. Charlie and Robert were not soldiers, they were symptoms of the gang's decay. They were soft, pliable men, devoid of the iron core that had defined the riders of the 60s. Jesse knew they were inferior stock. He could smell the desperation on them, the stench of men who wanted the glory of the outlaw life without the fortitude to endure its hardships. Yet, he kept them close. Why? Because a king needs a court, even if that court is composed of jesters and traitors. Or perhaps, deep in his reptilian brain, he wanted them there to end it. The physical act of riding a horse, once his greatest joy and primary skill, had become a torture session. Years of hard riding had ossified his spine and ground the cartilage in his knees to dust. Every gallop sent shockwaves of agony through his skeleton, a rhythmic punishment for a life spent in the saddle. The romantic image of the outlaw galloping into the sunset was a lie, the reality was hemorrhoids, saddle sores, and kidneys bruised to the point of passing blood. His body was failing him, betraying him in a slow, humiliating mutiny that no amount of willpower could suppress. The economics of his survival were equally grim. The loot from the train robberies was never enough. The money evaporated, consumed by the costs of hiding, by bribes, by the need to support his family and the families of his jailed comrades. There was no vast treasure buried in the hills, only a constant, grinding need for cash flow. He was running a business with high overheads and diminishing returns. The legend of the Robin Hood of the West was a fabrication for the newspapers. In reality, he was a desperate man robbing working-class male clerks just to keep the lights on and the pantry stocked. Sleep had become a stranger to him. The nights were long vigils spent staring at the ceiling, listening to the settling of the house and the wind in the eaves. Insomnia is the curse of the hunted. To sleep is to be vulnerable, to relinquish control. His mind, deprived of rest, began to fracture. He saw omens in the flight of birds, heard warnings in the creaking of timber. The line between reality and hallucination blurred, leaving him stranded in a twilight zone of anxiety where every shadow held a knife and every silence concealed an ambush. The city of St. Joseph, where he now hid, was a bustling hub of the very civilization that wanted him dead. It was a city of commerce, of stockyards and warehouses, a place where everything had a price tag. Hiding there was an act of hubris, a thumb in the eye of fate. He walked the streets among the people who read the headlines about his crimes, a wolf in a tweed suit, tipping his hat to the wives of bankers. There was a thrill in it, certainly, but it was the thrill of a man walking a tightrope over a pit of vipers, knowing that his balance was failing. He looked at his hands often, hands that had killed men, hands that had held bags of gold, hands that now shook with a subtle tremor he tried to hide. They were the hands of a killer, yes, but they were also the hands of a father who played with his children in the yard. This cognitive dissonance was tearing him apart. How does one reconcile the monster with the man? He could not. The two halves of his psyche were at war, and the battlefield was his own exhausted nervous system. The tension was unsustainable, something had to break. The interior of his home reflected this chaotic duality. On the surface, it was a respectable middle-class residence, filled with the bric-a-brac of the era, doilies, porcelain figurines, the heavy, dark furniture that was fashionable. But underneath, it was a fortress. Weapons were stashed in every room, hidden behind cushions and inside drawers. Every exit was calculated, every sightline analyzed. It was a house built on a foundation of nitroglycerin, waiting for the slightest spark to reduce it to splinters. The air in the house on that fateful April morning was heavy with more than just humidity, it was heavy with the weight of unspoken things. Jesse moved through the rooms like a ghost haunting his own life. He knew, on some cellular level, that the end was near. The predator senses the change in the wind before the storm breaks. He watched Robert Ford, saw the way the younger man's eyes lingered on him, saw the nervous twitch in Ford's cheek. A younger, sharper Jesse would have drawn his gun and ended the threat instantly. But this Jesse, this tired, broken Thomas Howard, simply watched. Perhaps he was tired of running. Perhaps the sheer exhaustion of maintaining the myth had become heavier than the fear of death. To die would be to rest, to finally put down the crushing burden of being Jesse James. The biological imperative to survive was fighting a losing battle against the psychological desire for oblivion. He was a machine running on fumes, the gears grinding metal on metal, the heat rising to a critical point. The hero of the Confederacy was gone, all that remained was a man with a headache and a stiff back, waiting for the inevitable betrayal that would set him free. Outside, the world churned on. The locomotives belched black smoke into the pristine sky, the telegraph keys chattered their binary code of commerce and capture, and the sun beat down on the muddy streets of St. Joseph with indifferent intensity. The stage was set, not for a grand opera, but for a sordid little play in one act. The props were ready, the dusty picture, the chair, the pearl-handled revolver. The actors were in place. History was holding its breath, ready to exhale the stench of gunpowder and treachery. The tragedy of Jesse James was not that he died, but that he had lived too long. He had outlived his era, outlived his cause, and outlived his own usefulness. He was a relic, a curiosity, a dangerous pet that had to be put down for the safety of the community. And as he stood in that parlor, listening to the silence of the house, he was arguably already dead. The bullet that was coming was merely a formality, a biological punctuation mark at the end of a sentence that had been rambling on for far too long. The cold logic of the new America was about to assert itself, and it would do so with the loud, ugly bang of a cowardly gun. In this suffocating atmosphere, impregnated with the sour reek of cheap tobacco and the acrid musk of animal fear, Robert Ford materialized not as a villain, but as a symptom. He was the ideal product of his time, a hollow vessel waiting to be filled with the borrowed significance of greater men. Bob Ford was a nonentity, a smudge on the glass of history, hungry for greatness but lacking the spinal column to achieve it through creation or conquest. He chose instead the path of appropriation. He worshipped Jesse James with the feverish intensity of a zealot, but it was the love of a parasite for its host, a consuming affection that could only end with the host being hollowed out from the inside. Ford was 20 years old, a young man with a face that refused to stick in the memory, possessing the kind of beige features that allowed him to blend into the wallpaper of any room. He was slight of build, lacking the physical imposition of the guerrilla fighters he idolized, and his eyes held a watery, shifting quality that betrayed a perpetual internal calculation. He did not walk with the heavy, spurred stride of a gunman, he scuttled. He moved through the world sideways, always looking for an angle, always seeking the path of least resistance. In the Darwinian struggle of the frontier, where the weak were culled by the winter or the noose, Ford had developed the survival mechanism of the remora fish, attaching himself to a shark in the hope of eating its scraps. He slept in Jesse's house, beneath the roof of the men he intended to butcher. He broke bread at the family table, passing the biscuits and the gravy to the children whose father he was pricing by the pound. There is a specific, intimate horror in this domestic infiltration. It requires a disconnection of the soul that is almost reptilian. To listen to a man breathe in his sleep, to watch him play with his daughter, and to simultaneously visualize the trajectory of a bullet through his skull is a form of madness that the 19th century began to mass-produce. It was the madness of the accountant who values the insurance payout more than the life it covers. Robert Ford and his brother Charlie were rats in human shape, but to dismiss them merely as vermin is to miss the sociological lesson they offer. History teaches us that it is the rats who inherit the earth when the lions have been exterminated by starvation or high-caliber rounds. The lions, with their roars and their codes of honor, are too loud, too large, and too expensive to maintain in a civilized society. The rats are quiet. They are adaptable. They require less food and have no honor to weigh them down. In the eyes of the Ford brothers, there was no burning hatred for Jesse, no vendetta born of blood. There was only the icy calculation of small-time shopkeepers who had arrived to collect an overdue debt from a bankrupt patron. The currency of this transaction was $10,000. In the year 1882, $10,000 was not merely a sum of money, it was a passport to a new reality. It was enough to buy a sprawling farm, a successful business, or a seat in the legislature. It was a life-altering fortune that dangled before Robert Ford like a golden carrot. Governor Thomas Crittenden had placed this bounty on the table, not for the capture of the bandit, but for his delivery, dead or alive. And everyone knew that alive was merely a polite fiction. The state wanted a corpse, and Robert Ford was the lowest bidder willing to undertake the demolition work. Charlie Ford, the older brother, was arguably even more pathetic than Robert. He had been with Jesse longer, had eaten more of his food, and had been treated with a kindness that Jesse rarely extended to others. Charlie was a man of weak constitution, easily led, a piece of driftwood caught in the wake of his younger brother's ambition. Together, they formed a feedback loop of cowardice. Alone, neither might have had the nerve to pull the trigger, but together, they reinforced each other's treachery, whispering justifications in the dark until the unthinkable became the inevitable. They convinced themselves that they were not traitors, but agents of justice, a delusion necessary to keep their hands from shaking too violently. The tension within the James household during those final days was a tangible force, a static charge building before a lightning strike. The air was thick with the unsaid. Jesse, despite his paranoia, had a blind spot for the Fords. Perhaps he saw their weakness and mistook it for harmlessness. A wolf does not fear the sheep, and Jesse, in his arrogance, failed to realize that a sheep with a knife is more dangerous than another wolf. He bullied them gently, mocked their lack of skill with firearms, and treated them with the condescending affection of a king for his fools. Every joke he made at their expense was another coin dropped into the bank of their resentment. Bob Ford absorbed these slights with a plastic smile, while his mind raced through the logistics of the murder. He was rehearsing the act in his head, over and over, refining the blocking of the scene like a stage director. He knew he could not beat Jesse in a fair fight, the outlaw's reflexes were legendary, honed by decades of survival. A duel was out of the question. It had to be an execution. It had to be sudden, unseen, and absolute. The romantic notion of the fair draw was a lie told by dime novels. On the real frontier, you shot a man when he was looking at a picture, or tying his boot, or sleeping. You killed him not to prove you were faster, but to ensure you were the one who walked away. The weapon chosen for this deed was a pearl-handled revolver, a gift from Jesse to Bob. The irony was heavy enough to break floorboards. The object given in trust would be the instrument of betrayal. Bob cleaned the gun compulsively, oiling the mechanism, checking the cylinder. It was a fetish object for him, the key that would unlock the door to his fame. He did not see the gun as a tool of murder, he saw it as a magic wand that would transmute him from a nobody into the men who killed Jesse James. He fantasized about the headlines, the acclaim, the gasps of the crowd when he walked into a saloon. He did not understand that the crowd would not gasp in awe, but in revulsion. During meals, the sound of chewing seemed deafening to the brothers. Every clink of silverware on china sounded like a hammer being cocked. They watched Jesse eat, watched the muscles of his jaw work, watched the life flowing through him, and they felt the crushing weight of their secret. They were spies in the camp of a doomed general. The food turned to ash in their mouths, but they swallowed it anyway, because to stop eating would be to draw suspicion. They were actors on a stage where the penalty for forgetting a line was death. The weather conspired to heighten the drama. It was an unusually warm April, the humidity rising from the muddy streets of St. Joseph and turning the house into a pressure cooker. Sweat stained the collars of their shirts, a physical manifestation of their guilt. The heat made tempers short and patience thin. It was the kind of weather that breeds violence, where the atmosphere itself feels like a heavy hand pressing down on the back of the neck. The flies buzzed against the window panes, trapped and frantic, mirroring the internal state of the Ford brothers. Jesse, for his part, was planning another robbery. He was talking about hitting the Platte City Bank, drawing maps, assigning roles. He included Bob and Charlie in these plans, promising them a cut that would make them rich. It was a pathetic delusion. There was no gang left, only these two traitors. The Platte City robbery was a phantom, a dream of a past glory that would never return. Bob nodded along, pointing at the map, agreeing to the strategy, all while knowing that the only bank he would be visiting was the one where he would deposit the governor's check. The night before the murder, a terrible storm rolled over the city. Thunder shook the foundations of the house, and lightning illuminated the rooms in stark, strobe light flashes. It was as if nature was staging a dress rehearsal for the violence to come. The Fords lay in their beds, listening to the rain hammer against the roof, wide awake. They knew the next day would be the one. The waiting had become intolerable. The bowstring was pulled back as far as it could go. If they did not release it, it would snap and take their fingers with it. Bob Ford thought about the $10,000. He thought about the silk suits he would buy, the women he would impress, the respect he would command. He constructed a palace of the mind built on the foundation of a corpse. He told himself that Jesse was a killer, a menace, a mad dog that needed to be put down. He used the language of morality to bandage the wound of his treachery. It is a common psychological trick. The executioner always convinces himself he is the surgeon removing a tumor, not the butcher slaughtering a prize steer. As the sun rose on that third day of April, the air was still and heavy. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and glistening, but the rot inside the house remained. The smell of frying bacon and boiling coffee filled the kitchen, the ultimate scent of domestic normalcy. It was a morning like any other, which is the terrifying truth of tragedy. The apocalypse rarely arrives with fanfares, it arrives with the breakfast dishes. Jesse sat at the table, unaware that he was eating his last meal. He read the newspaper, commenting on the news, complaining about the government. He was so undeniably alive, so mundane in his habits, that it seemed impossible he would be dead before noon. The brothers exchanged glances across the table. The silent communication of conspirators is a language of micro-expressions, a twitch of the eye, a tightening of the lip. The signal was given and received. The time for hesitation had passed. They were no longer men, they were mechanisms set in motion by greed and fear. They rose from the table, their chairs scraping against the wood floor with a harsh, jarring sound. The play was entering its final act. In the parlor, the light filtered through the lace curtains, casting intricate shadows on the carpet. The room was a shrine to middle-class respectability, filled with the accumulation of a life that was trying desperately to look normal. But in the center of this normality stood the anomaly, Jesse James, the outlaw king, feeling the heat, feeling the itch of his skin, unaware that the scythe was already swinging toward his neck. Bob Ford touched the handle of the revolver in his pocket. It was cold, hard, and real. The time for dreaming was over. The time for biology and ballistics had arrived. The shopkeeper was about to close the deal. The murder scene was nauseatingly domestic, stripped of every shred of cinematic pathos or operatic grandeur. It was a tableau of banality that would have disappointed any dramatist seeking a climax worthy of a legend. The parlor of the house on the hill was not a battlefield, it was a stifling box of middle-class affectation, smelling of boiled cabbage, stale pipe smoke, and the faint, sweet rot of damp plaster. The heat of the day had become a physical antagonist, a heavy, wet blanket that pressed against the temples and made the simple act of breathing feel like labor. It was this heat, this mindless atmospheric condition, that acted as the primary catalyst for the tragedy, proving once again that history turns not on the decisions of great men, but on the discomfort of biological organisms. Jesse James, the man who had ridden through the fires of the Civil War and outpaced the relentless pursuit of the Pinkertons, was defeated by the temperature. He removed his coat, revealing the sweat-stained shirt that clung to his torso like a second, sickly skin. The fabric was transparent with moisture, mapping the contours of a body that was beginning to soften around the edges, the predator turning into a bourgeois husband. He complained about the heat, a trivial grievance for a man who had slept in snowdrifts and bled in ditches, but the domestic life creates its own scale of suffering, where a drafty window or a hot room becomes a crisis. Then came the fatal error, a mistake so amateurish that it suggests a subconscious desire for cessation. Jesse unbuckled the heavy leather belt that held his twin revolvers. This belt was his exoskeleton, the external spine that had held him upright against the moral gravity of his crimes for nearly 2 decades. It contained the tools of his trade, the cold iron instruments that negotiated his survival. To remove it was to voluntarily declaw himself, to strip away the only authority he possessed in a world that recognized only force. He tossed the rig onto the bed with a careless thud, the sound of leather and steel hitting the mattress signaling the end of his reign as the alpha predator. He turned to the Ford brothers and offered a justification that sounded absurdly suburban. He claimed that the windows were open and he did not want the neighbors to spot him armed like a gorilla. It was the excuse of a man named Thomas Howard, a man worried about property values and gossip over the back fence. It was a lie he told himself to mask the fatigue that was eating his marrow. The truth was that the weight of the guns had become unbearable, not just physically, but metaphysically. He wanted, for a few minutes, to be just a man in a room, unburdened by the heavy machinery of death. He wanted to pretend that he was safe in his own den, a delusion that nature usually punishes with immediate extinction. The room was silent save for the buzzing of a housefly, a mindless drone tracing erratic patterns in the stagnant air. Jesse moved with a lethargy that was painful to watch. He was a machine running down, the mainspring unwound, the gears grinding on grit. His eyes, usually scanning the perimeter for threats, settled on a trivial imperfection in the room's decor. A picture on the wall was hanging crookedly. It was a dusty, insignificant thing. Reports vary on whether it was a needlepoint urging God to bless the home or a lithograph of the racehorse Skyrocket, but its asymmetry offended him. In a life defined by chaos and flight, he had developed a neurotic need for order in his immediate surroundings. He could not control the railroads, the banks, or the governor, but he could control the angle of a picture frame. He picked up a dusting cloth, a tool of the housewife, not the highwayman. The incongruity of the image was grotesque. Here was the most feared man in America, a killer with a bounty on his head that could purchase a large farm, fretting over dust motes. He approached the wall with a singular focus, his back turning away from the room. He turned his back on the door. He turned his back on the window. Most critically, he turned his back on Robert and Charlie Ford. It was an act of trust that defied all logic, a suicidal exposure of the vital organs to known scavengers. It was as if he were daring the universe to close the trap. The picture was hung high, too high for him to reach comfortably from the floor. He dragged a cane-bottomed chair to the wall, the wooden legs scraping against the floorboards with a harsh, dry sound that grated on the nerves. He stepped up onto the chair. This elevation was his final undoing. By standing on the chair, he placed himself in a position of supreme instability. He was no longer grounded. He was teetering on a piece of cheap furniture, his center of gravity high, his movement restricted. He was presenting himself as a stationary target, lifted up as if on a pedestal for the convenience of his executioners. From the perspective of the Ford brothers, the transformation was total. The man standing on the chair was not the terrifying leader who had commanded their obedience, he was a domestic caricature. He was a husband doing chores. The mystique of the outlaw evaporated, leaving only a man in a sweaty shirt with his pants slightly too loose without the belt, stretching to reach a dusty frame. The psychological barrier that prevents a subordinate from killing a superior crumbled. You do not shoot a king is divine. But you can shoot a man who looks like he is about to clean the windows. The banality of the moment stripped Jesse of his armor. Robert Ford watched this sequence of events with the cold, predatory gaze of a reptile sensing a shift in the environment. He sat on the edge of the bed, his hand hovering near his pocket. He saw the gun belt lying on the quilt, just a few feet away, yet a million miles out of Jesse's reach. He saw the broad expanse of Jesse's back, the vulnerable nape of the neck, the spot behind the right ear where the skull is thin and the brain is busy processing the visual input of the wallpaper. It was a geometry problem, and the solution was screaming in his mind. The variables had aligned perfectly: the distance, the angle, the absence of defensive capability. Charlie Ford, the weaker of the two, winked at his brother. It was a grotesque gesture, a spasm of conspiracy that signaled the collapse of the last moral restraint. The brothers rose from their seats, not with a sudden leap, but with the fluid, silent motion of water rising in a flood. They drew their revolvers. The sound of the hammers cocking was loud in the small room, a mechanical click-clack that surely must have reached Jesse's ears. It is impossible to believe he did not hear it. Perhaps he did hear it and chose to ignore it, paralyzed by the realization that his time had come. Perhaps he thought it was just the house settling, or the cracking of his own weary joints. Or perhaps, in a final act of denial, he simply refused to believe that the boys he had fed at his table would bite the hand that offered the bread. Jesse continued to dust the picture. The cloth moved back and forth, a hypnotic, rhythmic motion. He was fussing with the alignment, tilting the frame a fraction of an inch to the left, then a fraction to the right. He was murmuring something to himself, perhaps a comment on the dust, perhaps a curse at the heat. He was completely absorbed in the minutiae of the household, utterly divorced from the violence that was gathering behind him like a storm front. He was playing house in the middle of an assassination. The irony was acidic. This was the man who had robbed the steamboat Natchez by moonlight, who had leapt over canyon walls on horseback, who had survived the slaughter of Centralia. And here he was, dying of domesticity. The civilization he had fought against had not defeated him with marshals or armies, it had defeated him with wallpaper, furniture, and the crushing boredom of a Sunday afternoon. He was being killed not by a warrior, but by the concept of the home itself. The trap was not a canyon or a box canyon, the trap was the parlor. Robert Ford raised the pearl-handled revolver. The weapon was heavy in his hand, a tangible piece of history that was about to be made. He leveled the barrel at the back of Jesse's head. The distance was no more than a few feet. At this range, ballistics become a certainty. There is no need to aim, only to point. The sights aligned with the base of the skull, the point where the spine meets the brain, the command center of the central nervous system. Ford held his breath. His heart was hammering against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of adrenaline and terror, but his hand was steady enough. Greed is a powerful stabilizer. The moment stretched, expanding into an eternity. The dust motes danced in the shaft of sunlight that cut through the window, indifferent to the murder. The fly buzzed. The smell of the hot room was cloying. Jesse stood on the chair, a statue of vulnerability, his hand reaching up to the picture, his posture open and defenseless. He was correcting the tilt of the world, trying to make it straight, unaware that the world was about to shatter. It was a scene of profound indignity. Death in battle has a certain horrific majesty, it acknowledges the status of the warrior. But this was an execution carried out in a scullery. It was the slaughter of livestock. Jesse was not being treated as an adversary, he was being treated as a nuisance, an obstacle to be removed so that the transaction could be completed. The Ford brothers were not duelists, they were sanitation workers clearing away a piece of refuse that was blocking the flow of commerce. The silence in the room was a physical pressure, a vacuum waiting to be filled by the explosion. Every detail was magnified, the pattern of the rug, the fraying cuff of Jesse's trousers, the beads of sweat on Bob Ford's upper lip. The universe had contracted to this single room, this single vector of violence. The history of the West, with all its grand narratives of expansion and freedom, had narrowed down to a dirty little room in Missouri and a piece of lead waiting to fly. Jesse shifted his weight on the chair. The wood creaked. It was the sound of a coffin lid closing. He began to turn his head, perhaps sensing the change in the air pressure, perhaps hearing the silence of the brothers behind him. He started to pivot, just a fraction, just enough to bring his profile into view. But he was too late. The biological clock had run out. The economic transaction was processed. The trigger was squeezed, not with anger, but with the desperate squeeze of a man holding onto a winning lottery ticket. The hammer fell. The firing pin struck the primer. The chemical reaction within the cartridge ignited, expanding gases pushing the lead slug down the rifled barrel. Physics took over where morality had failed. The bullet left the muzzle at a velocity that rendered human reaction time irrelevant. It bridged the gap between the traitor and the legend in a fraction of a heartbeat. There was no time for regret, no time for a prayer, no time for a final witty remark. There was only the physics of impact, the transfer of kinetic energy from metal to bone, and the sudden, irrevocable end of the man who called himself Thomas Howard. The great irony was complete. The man who had lived by the gun had died because he took it off. The man who had made a living terrorizing the institutions of civilization was killed by the mundane trappings of a civilized home. The dust cloth fell from his hand, a white flag of surrender in a war he didn't know he was losing. The picture on the wall remained crooked, a testament to the fact that in this life, nothing is ever truly set right. The blood that was about to spray across the wall would be the only splash of color in a gray, dusty ending. The Robin Hood of the frontier was gone, erased by a dusting accident and a greedy boy with a shaky hand. The myth ended not with a bang, but with the squeak of a cheap chair. Robert Ford did not hesitate for a single, trembling fraction of a second. The biological imperative to survive had completely overridden any lingering moral architecture in his mind, reducing him to a simple mechanism of cause and effect. He drew the pearl-handled revolver, a weapon that was, in a twist of supreme irony, a gift from the very men he was about to butcher, and thumbed back the hammer. The sound of the mechanism locking into place was the only warning given, a sharp metallic click that bridged the gap between betrayal and execution. The explosion that followed was deafening in the confined space, a thunderclap of sulfur and lead that shattered the domestic stillness of the afternoon and signaled the violent liquidation of the West's most notorious asset. The bullet traversed the short distance between the traitor and the legend with indifferent efficiency. It entered the skull just behind the right ear, a soft point of entry for a projectile traveling at such velocity. There was no cinematic resistance, the lead smashed through the bone and plowed into the soft, gray matter that held the memories of the Civil War, the plans for future robberies, and the love for his children. In less than the blink of an eye, the consciousness of Jesse James was extinguished. The bullet did not merely kill him, it erased him. It exited through the forehead, spraying a horrific mixture of blood, bone fragments, and brain tissue across the floral wallpaper, turning the mundane pattern into a Jackson Pollock of biological waste. There were no last words, no profound final statements to be recorded by historians or etched onto tombstones. The mythology of the outlaw demands a soliloquy, but the reality of ballistics permits only silence. The body simply ceased to be a person and became an object, a heavy sack of organic material subject to the laws of gravity. He crumpled without grace, his knees giving way, his torso twisting as he fell backward. The crash of his skull against the floorboards was a dull, wet thud, the sound of a melon being dropped from a height. The dust cloth he had been using fluttered slowly to the ground, landing beside the corpse like a white flag of surrender that had come too late. The silence that followed the gunshot was heavy and ringing, a vacuum created by the sudden violence. The room was instantly filled with the acrid, stinging smoke of black powder, a blue-gray cloud that hung in the humid air like a phantom. Through this haze, Robert Ford stood frozen, his arm still extended, the smoking gun pointing at the emptiness where a man had stood a second ago. He looked not like a hero, but like a child who has broken a valuable vase, stunned by the irrevocability of his own action. Charlie Ford stood beside him, his mouth agape, his face draining of color until it matched the pallor of the dead men on the floor. Then came the scream. It did not start as a human sound, it began as a low, guttural vibration that rose rapidly in pitch until it shattered the heavy silence. Zerelda James, rushing in from the kitchen with her hands still wet from dishwater, did not weep in the theatrical manner of a grieving widow. She howled. It was the raw, animalistic noise of a mammal that has seen its mate destroyed, a sound of pure biological distress that stripped away all civilization. She threw herself onto the floor, ignoring the blood that was pooling rapidly around her husband's head, ignoring the gruesome ruin of his face. She cradled him, her calico dress soaking up the life that was draining out of him, her hands slipping in the slick, warm mess of his demise. She looked up at the Ford brothers, her eyes wide with a horror that transcended language. She did not ask why or how. In that moment, she saw them not as men, but as monsters, predators that had invaded the sanctity of her den. "You've killed him," she shrieked, the words tearing at her throat. "You've killed him." It was an accusation that carried the weight of a divine judgment. She tried to wipe the blood from his face with her apron, a futile, heartbreaking gesture of care for a machine that was broken beyond repair. The copper scent of blood began to overpower the smell of the kitchen, a metallic tang that coated the back of the throat and induced a primal nausea. Robert and Charlie Ford recoiled from this display of grief. They did not offer assistance, they did not offer apologies. They backed away, their boots scuffling on the floorboards, their eyes fixed on the carnage they had wrought. The reality of the murder was far messier, far louder, and far more visceral than the abstract calculations they had made in the dark. They had expected a clean transaction, a bullet for a check, but they had received a slaughterhouse. They stepped over the legs of the corpse, a final indignity, crossing the physical boundary between the living and the dead. They were no longer guests, they were intruders, parasites fleeing the host they had just consumed. They stumbled out onto the porch, gasping for air as if they had been underwater. The bright sunlight of the Missouri afternoon hit them with the force of a physical blow. It seemed impossible that the sun was still shining, that the birds were still singing, that the world was continuing its rotation. Inside the house, a world had ended. Outside, the indifference of the universe was absolute. They holstered their guns, the metal still warm against their thighs, burning brands that marked them as the architects of this tragedy. They grabbed their hats, jamming them onto their heads to shield their eyes, not from the sun, but from the gaze of a god they likely no longer believed in. They did not run, for running implies guilt, and they were desperately trying to cling to the delusion that they were agents of the law. They walked fast, their strides jerky and uncoordinated, their adrenaline-flooded systems making their movements twitchy. They practically fell over the garden fence in their haste to put distance between themselves and the wailing woman. They mounted their horses, the animals skittish and sensing the anxiety radiating from their riders. As they spurred the beasts into motion, they left behind the house on the hill, now forever marked as a site of infamy, a tourist attraction in the making where ghouls would soon come to stare at the bloodstains. Their destination was the telegraph office. This was the true altar of the new age, the place where information was transmuted into power. They needed to send a wire to Governor Crittenden, to the sheriff, to the world. They needed to validate the contract. The ride to the center of St. Joseph was a blur of mud and panic. They passed citizens going about their daily business, men hauling ice, women shopping for fabric, people who had no idea that the era of the Wild West had just been terminated by a shot to the back of the head. The Fords felt a strange separation from these people. They were no longer part of the common herd. They were celebrities, or perhaps pariahs, they were not yet sure which. Inside the telegraph office, the air was cool and smelled of ozone and dry paper. The rhythmic clacking of the telegraph key was the heartbeat of the modern world, a binary language of dots and dashes that cared nothing for human suffering. Robert Ford, his hand shaking so violently he could barely hold the pencil, scrawled his message. It was a declaration of ownership. "I have killed Jesse James," he wrote. He did not write, "We have captured the outlaw," or, "Justice has been served." He wrote, "I have killed." He was claiming the copyright on the death, staking his claim to the reward money and the fame that would surely follow. The clerk reading the message looked up, his face pale, realizing that the sweaty, trembling young man before him was either a liar or the most dangerous man in Missouri. But the reception was not what they had fantasized. They expected a hero's welcome, a parade, a handshake from the mayor. Instead, the machinery of the law began to grind with slow, confused friction. Marshal Enos Craig arrived, not with a brass band, but with a look of skeptical disgust. The brothers surrendered their weapons, the pearl-handled revolver and a Colt, placing them on the desk like offerings. "We are the men who killed Jesse James," Bob repeated, his voice cracking, desperate for the validation that would turn his treachery into civic duty. He needed someone to tell him he was a good man, because the scream of Zerelda James was still echoing in his auditory cortex. The law, however, is a creature of technicalities. There was no warrant for the arrest of Jesse James in that specific jurisdiction for that specific crime at that specific moment. Technically, legally, the Ford brothers had simply walked into a private home and murdered a citizen named Thomas Howard. The irony was thick enough to choke on. They were taken into custody, not as state-sanctioned executioners, but as common murderers. The cell door clanged shut with a heavy, iron finality that mirrored the sound of the coffin lid. They sat on the narrow cots, the adrenaline crashing, leaving them shivering in the damp coolness of the jail. Back at the house, the news traveled with the speed of a virus. Neighbors gathered at the fence, peering over the rails like vultures circling carrion. The doctor arrived, confirming what was visually obvious: the subject was deceased. The coroner arrived to claim the body. The sanctity of the home was violated by a stream of officials, reporters, and curiosity seekers. The blood on the floor was still wet, sticky, and dark, beginning to congeal into a crust. The flies, drawn by the scent of death, began to arrive in droves, buzzing over the red puddle, indifferent to the fact that this blood had once belonged to a king. Zerelda sat in the corner, her dress ruined, her face a mask of tragedy. She watched as they lifted her husband's body onto a plank. His head lolled to the side, the hole in his skull visible to all. The illusion of Thomas Howard was gone, the corpse was undeniably Jesse James. The scars on his chest, the missing finger tip, the sheer physical presence of the men, even in death, confirmed his identity. He was being catalogued, measured, and prepared for the final indignity of the public display. The man was gone, the commodity remained. In the jail cell, Bob Ford stared at his hands. They were clean of blood, but they felt filthy. He thought about the $10,000. He tried to visualize the stack of bills, the weight of the gold, but the image kept dissolving into the sight of the brain matter on the wall. He realized, with a sinking sensation in his gut, that the transaction was not as simple as he had believed. He had sold his soul, yes, but the market value of a soul is fluctuating and uncertain. He had killed the past to buy a future, but as the sun set on St. Joseph, the shadows in the cell grew long and dark, looking suspiciously like the bars of a cage. The telegraph wires hummed in the wind, carrying the news across the continent. Jesse James is dead. The sentence appeared on tickers in New York, in Chicago, in London. It was consumed by bankers in velvet chairs and laborers in saloons. It was the end of a story that the nation had been telling itself for decades. But for Robert Ford, sitting in the gloom, listening to the breathing of his brother and the distant noises of the street, the story was just beginning. It was a story of a different kind, a story of slow corrosion, of a reward that would turn to ash, and of a ghost that would never, ever stop following him. The biological survival was secured, but the social execution had already begun. The check was in the mail, but the cost of postage would be higher than he could ever afford. But the true grotesquerie did not begin with the gunshot, it began with the applause, or rather, the lack thereof. The most repulsive chapter of this saga was not written in blood, but in the ink of cheap theater programs and the grease paint of the vaudeville stage. Society, that fickle and schizophrenic beast, which had clamored for the head of Jesse James only days prior, suddenly decided that it detested the men who delivered it. The governor granted the Ford brothers their pardon, a piece of paper that legally washed their hands clean, but he could not legislate the public disgust. The reward money, $10,000, was whittled down by legal fees and bureaucratic theft until only a fraction reached their pockets. To survive, Robert Ford was forced to do the unthinkable. He had to sell the only thing he owned, his infamy. He became a performer in a circus of the macabre, a traveling sideshow attraction that toured the smoky music halls and dime museums of the Midwest. The act was titled, The Outlaws of Missouri, a grandiose name for a sordid little play that consisted of two men reenacting a murder. Night after night, in towns that smelled of coal smoke and horse manure, Robert Ford walked onto a rickety wooden stage to play himself. His brother Charlie, whose nerves were already fraying like an old rope, was cast in the role of Jesse James. It was a psychological torture chamber disguised as entertainment. They were trapped in a loop of violence, forced to relive the betrayal hundreds of times, turning a moment of tragedy into a mechanical, hollow pantomime for the amusement of strangers. The audience did not come to cheer the hero who slew the monster, they came to gawk at the freak. They paid their 10 cents to see the traitor, the coward, the men who shot his friend in the back. When Bob raised the prop revolver, a harmless toy compared to the lethal instrument he had used in St. Joseph, the crowd did not gasp in suspense. They hissed. They threw pennies, rotten vegetables, and insults. They called him a Judas, a rat, a snake. Bob had to stand there, bathed in the harsh glare of the gaslights, and absorb this hatred. He had to bow to people who despised him, smiling that plastic, terrified smile, realizing too late that he had not purchased fame, but infamy. He was not a celebrity, he was a biological specimen of treachery, pinned to a board for the public to examine. The repetition of the act began to erode their sanity with the efficiency of dripping water on stone. Every night, Charlie had to die. Every night, Bob had to kill him. The line between the performance and reality blurred. The fake gunshot became a nightly reminder of the real explosion that had destroyed their lives. Charlie Ford was the first to break under the pressure. The guilt, combined with a morphine addiction he developed to numb the phantom pain of his conscience, hollowed him out. 2 years after the murder, Charlie took a revolver, pressed it to his chest, and finally played the scene for real, ending his own misery in a splash of red that no audience was there to applaud. Robert was left alone, a solo act in a tragedy that no longer had a plot. He drifted westward, pushed by the scorn of the civilized world toward the jagged, lawless spine of the Rockies. He ended up in Creede, Colorado, a silver mining boomtown that was less a settlement than an open sore on the side of a mountain. Creede was a place of mud, freezing rain, and desperate men, a chaotic hive of tents and shacks where the only law was the survival of the richest. Here, the mud was deep enough to swallow a mule, and the air was thin and sharp, smelling of pine resin and unwashed bodies. It was the end of the line, the place where the sediment of the frontier collected when there was nowhere else to go. In this frozen purgatory, Bob Ford opened a saloon. It was a tent saloon, a canvas cathedral to vice, later upgraded to a clapboard structure that he named the Exchange. The name was fitting, for everything in Bob's life had been a transaction: friendship for money, life for fame, dignity for survival. He grew fat and sullen, his face puffing up with the bloat of cheap whiskey and constant anxiety. He wore diamonds on his fingers, gaudy, sparkling stones that looked ridiculous on his shaking hands. He was trying to project an image of success, of a sporting man, but everyone in Creede knew who he was. They came to his bar not to drink his liquor, which was watered down and overpriced, but to stare at the men who killed Jesse James. He lived in a state of perpetual paranoia. He knew, with the instinct of a hunted animal, that the cycle of violence he had initiated was not a straight line, but a circle. He had killed a legend to become famous, it was inevitable that someone would eventually kill him to achieve the same dark distinction. He kept a shotgun behind the bar and slept with a revolver under his pillow, his eyes darting to the door every time it swung open to admit a gust of snowy wind. He was a prisoner in his own establishment, serving drinks to men who whispered behind their hands and spat on his floor. The celebrity he had craved had become a cage, and the bars were made of public contempt. Enter Edward O'Kelly. If Robert Ford was a rat, O'Kelly was a rabid dog, a drifting lawman, a petty criminal, a man with a soul as gray and empty as the Colorado sky. O'Kelly harbored a vague, undefined hatred for Ford, perhaps because Ford represented everything O'Kelly despised in himself: weakness, treachery, and the desperate need for attention. Or perhaps O'Kelly simply did the math and realized that killing the killer of Jesse James would make him the man who killed the men. It was the same primitive equation that had motivated Ford, a desire to steal significance by destroying a significant object. O'Kelly stalked the streets of Creede with a double-barreled shotgun, a weapon that requires no finesse, only proximity and malice. The date was the 8th of June, 1892. The day was crisp and bright, the sun reflecting off the patches of snow that still clung to the mountain peaks. Bob Ford was in his saloon, engaged in the mundane task of preparing for the evening rush. He was dealing with a customer or perhaps wiping down the bar. History is vague on the trivial details, but clear on the outcome. He was unarmed at that moment, or at least his weapons were not in his hands. He was relaxed, or as relaxed as a man like him could ever be, lulled into a false sense of security by the routine of commerce. Edward O'Kelly entered the saloon. He did not sneak in, he walked in with the heavy, deliberate tread of an executioner. He carried the shotgun like a scepter of judgment. He saw Ford standing by the bar, his back turned, or perhaps in profile. The scene mirrored the death of Jesse James with a chilling, geometric precision. The victim was distracted, engaged in domestic labor, vulnerable. But O'Kelly, unlike Ford, granted his victim a fraction of a second of acknowledgement. He called out, "Hello, Bob." Ford turned. He spun around to face the voice, his eyes widening as they registered the twin black tunnels of the shotgun barrels. He did not have time to reach for a weapon. He did not have time to beg. He barely had time to recognize his own death approaching. O'Kelly squeezed both triggers simultaneously. The roar of the shotgun was deafening in the enclosed space, a thunderclap that signaled the closing of the account. The blast hit Bob Ford in the neck and chest. At such close range, a shotgun does not merely wound, it excavates. The charge of buckshot tore through the soft tissue of his throat, severing the jugular, the windpipe, and the spine. It was a massive, catastrophic trauma that instantly disconnected the brain from the body. There was no suffering, only a sudden, violent cessation of existence. Bob Ford fell backward, his body hitting the floor amidst the sawdust and the spittle of his customers. The blood that pumped from his ruined neck was bright arterial red, a vivid contrast to the dingy brown of the saloon floor. He died as he had lived in his later years, messy, bloated, and despised. The reaction of the town was a final testament to the cynicism of the frontier. There was no weeping, no rending of garments. A crowd gathered, but it was a crowd of curiosity seekers, eager to see the corpse of the famous coward. They looked at the body with the same detached interest one might show a dead coyote on the roadside. O'Kelly was arrested, but many in the town viewed him as an avenging angel, or at least as a man who had taken out the trash. He would eventually be pardoned, only to be killed himself in a shootout with a policeman years later, continuing the senseless, grinding friction of the West. Bob Ford was buried in Creed, then later moved, his bones restless even in death. His epitaph should have been a warning to all those who seek glory through treachery, but the West does not tolerate moral lessons, only survival of the fittest. The men who sought to etch his name in history succeeded only in becoming a footnote, a synonym for betrayal. He was not a villain in the grand, operatic sense, he was merely a small man who cast a short shadow, and when the sun went down, he vanished completely. This is the true nature of the Wild West, stripped of the technicolor sunsets and the swelling orchestral scores. It was not a crucible where heroes were forged, it was a giant industrial separator. It spun men around in a centrifugal frenzy of greed and violence, separating those who kill from those who are killed, until finally, inevitably, both are deposited into the same cold earth. The soil does not care if you were a legend like Jesse James or a traitor like Robert Ford. It digests the hero and the coward with equal indifference. The blood on the floor of the saloon in Creed dried just as quickly as the blood on the wallpaper in St. Joseph. It turned the same rusty brown color. The silver mines eventually played out, the towns turned to ghosts, and the wind blowing through the broken windows of the abandoned buildings whispered the only true lesson of the frontier: everything rots. The guns rust, the wood decays, and the stories we tell ourselves are just desperate attempts to dress up the slaughter in the rags of nobility. In the end, there is only the biology of the corpse and the economy of the grave. The West was not won, it was merely survived, until it couldn't be survived any longer.